Hey guys, today I'm back in Kerbal Space Program, and I saw a comment from someone saying I should try making a rocket using every engine in the game, and I thought that was pretty funny. Now, I could just make a rocket like this and call it a day, but that isn't any fun, and instead, I wanted to try making a rocket where every engine has some actual purpose. So, let's get right into it. Now, starting out in the sandbox, the first thing I did was put in a crew capsule, and after that, I'm putting down one of these really tiny fuel tanks. Now, the reason for that is that the last few stages, which are the first ones I'm putting on, are going to have a lot of the really small liquid fuel engines on them, so I just wanted to make sure I could stuff as many as possible in this area so I don't waste a ton of weight. Now I started out with the spider engine, which I actually have a whole video on, but after I put that on, I put the very similar ant engine on. Now I ended up deciding to switch them just because I thought it looked a little bit better to do this, and after I had that, I just started stacking a bunch of these side-mounted engines. The reason for this is that I didn't want them to get in the way of any of the bottom stages, so keeping them higher up was a little bit better. And after that, I just sort of stacked a whole bunch more engines on, and with that done, you see here, I put down a stack bicoupler, and I started working on some larger engines. Now for these medium engines here, I started out with the Reliant engine, and then I went to the Swivel engine. Now these are actually really similar engines, except the Reliant I think has a little bit more power, and the Swivel is able to swivel, which will be important later. But after I got all that done, I slapped on a couple docking ports, and I put down some decouplers here, and these are for some landers. Now in order to give some more engines actual purpose, I wanted to put down a couple landers, and I wanted to land on the moon and Minmus. So I just put some docking ports on those, and you can see I started out by putting down some vector engines. Now I was going to put a different engine on one side, but I wanted to start out the two vector engines, keep everything symmetrical, make it a little bit easier to build. Now with all that done, I also put down a probe core and I put down a nose cone, and I'm not going to be landing any Kerbals. I'm just going to use the probe core to conserve a little bit of weight, because the more tanks I add onto this, the more difficult it is to get into orbit and actually get to where I need to go. Now once I had all that done, I added in some more decouplers, and these are for some xenon tanks. Now these are meant for my deep space travel, and you see I just slapped those on there, and after that, just added on some nose cones, and I added in a bunch of solar panels, and these are meant to power those electric engines. Now with all that done, added on some more decouplers here, and I used some really large fuel tanks, and now I'm getting up to some of the larger engines. Now I started out here with two of those cheetah engines, and originally I was going to do an engine for every single layer, but then I quickly realized there's way too many layers to do that, so I ended up deleting this bottom stage, and I deleted one set of the cheetah engines, and I added another set on the other diagonal. Now these engines are slightly different heights, and that becomes very obvious here, so to fix that, I ended up adding in some decouplers to hopefully bridge the gap a little bit between the two, and after that, it looked pretty good. So I added in an adapter, and I started working on the large engines. Now I was struggling to find a fuel tank that was actually this size, and I'm pretty sure there isn't, but at the very least I can use the fuel in the adapter to power the next stage. Now I ended up pulling out all of the engines that were the right size, and you can see here there's 6, and that's actually a good thing, because it means I can attach them in pairs and only have 3 stages here. Now I started out with these two engines, which actually looked pretty similar, but then I realized the thrusts were incredibly different, and instead this poodle engine was going to be a lot closer to the smaller one. So I just ended up putting that on there, and the size difference became very obvious, so I had to use a whole bunch of decouplers to fill that gap. Once I did that though, I just slapped on a couple undersized fuel tanks, and I put down a couple more engines. Once I had that, just had to put down the last 2 engines like this, and with all that, actually ready to go for the boosters. Now to do this, you see here I have a couple of decouplers on the sides, and I'm putting down these really large fuel tanks. Now fortunately, there's actually 2 engines here which are really big and take this size, which means that I can perfectly fit them on the stage, and you can see me doing that here. Now with all that done, just add on a couple more decouplers, and the next thing to do is add on these sort of pre-configured engines. They already have fuel tanks on them, which is pretty convenient, so I just stacked a whole bunch around, and I was going to move on to solid fuel next, but I realized there's actually a really small solid rocket fuel booster here, and I could use this for the very top stage as my last acceleration. And once I did that, I also added a monopropellant tank because I forgot about these puff engines. So I just put a couple of those on top like that, and here you can see I'm actually switching out one of the lander's engines, and I'm replacing it with this other one instead. Now I didn't know this at the time, but it can't swivel at all, which is going to make landing a little tricky, but it should work out. And I should have most of the engines except the solid rocket fuel boosters, but it was a little struggling at the moment. So to hopefully prevent whatever that was from happening again, you can see here I'm adding in a whole bunch of struts. I also turned on auto strut, and after that, it seemed to be performing a lot better. In fact, it got off the ground and it was actually really fast. I guess all of those really large engines I put around it are really pulling their weight, and I actually had to turn down the throttle at a certain point because it was going a little bit too fast. Now I guess all the disjointed engines probably make it pretty weak here, but this is kind of unusable and it's gonna be impossible to control. So I added in some more struts to deal with that, and after that, I also added in some solid rocket boosters, and I'm gonna do this pretty quickly on the bottom here, but I ended up doing them diagonally so that every single booster had an equal one on the other side, so there's an equal amount of thrust going up, and it shouldn't want to tilt to one direction or the other. With that done though, you see here I'm adding in some more landers, and these ones I'm actually using jet engines for. Now I was a little unsure of what to use these for at first, since they're kind of weak, so in Kerbin's atmosphere, they're not really gonna do anything to get me out of here, but the only other place I can use these is on Laythe, so that was the plan. Now basically these these are all identical boosters just with different engines at the bottom of them, except this one here. I'm actually making it a 2-stage booster so that it has one of these really small jet engines on it, and the hope is that once I get in the atmosphere, I'm actually able to eject off the bottom part of it and at least turn it on for a short period of time. With that done though, I ended up adding in a couple more solid rocket fuel boosters that I hadn't used before, and finally here, I'm adding in some more boosters to the top, and these ones I was either planning on using as boosters or as landers. I wasn't quite sure yet, but I ended up just putting those on. I put a probe core on the off chance I wanted to land with them. Now, with that done, I had one more engine to put on, and it's this really large jet engine, and this one's actually going to be useful for getting me off the ground, so just put that down there. And with that done, I also had to add in some fins. Now, I started out by adding in some fins to these landers here, and I'm going to need these in Laythe's atmosphere, so just put those on there. And finally here, you can see on the bottoms of the boosters, I'm also putting down some of these large fins and some of these large elevons. Now, with that done, it should be pretty stable, and you can see here, I'm actually going for the full flight. Now, the first test, I wasn't really paying too close attention, and I realized the booster fell off, and it caused me to just fall over. So the new plan was to take off immediately, and that seemed to prevent anything from falling off, so yes, it works out. And with that done, I just kept burning up. Now, once I got up high enough, I started to do a turn, and I was doing this very slowly, because I was worried a quick turn would be pretty much unrecoverable, but when I was in the atmosphere, it was actually pretty stable here. Now, I had some boosters burn off, and I'm not dropping them, because I was a little bit worried about the stability here, because when I'm in the atmosphere, I don't need one of these to turn and hit me, and I just wanted to do this as safely as possible. So I ended up dropping both stages of boosters at once, and it did cost me a little bit of fuel to do this, but again, I think it was a little safer this way. And with all that done, I ended up just warping to the apoapsis, and this is one of the easiest parts of the flight, because I just have so much extra fuel, and it's not actually that laggy, so it's pretty easy to just get an orbit here. Now, I ended up extending out my orbit here, and I ended up passing the apoapsis by kind of a lot, and I misjudged this a little bit, but once I had that last stage burned out, I started on this next stage here, and it seemed like it was going to be unstable, but it seemed to hold itself together well enough. If that done, it's actually good enough to get me a full orbit here. And once I had this, it was time to work on the first part of my flight, and this is landing on the moon. Now, once I got an encounter here, I ended up swarping around to that maneuver node, and once I got there, I just started to do my burn. Now, I ran out of fuel in this bottom stage very quickly, and I had to start going into this next one. So you'll see here, I actually got reasonably far, and the first engines ended up burning out, so I just had these weak engines next, and with that, they actually burned out too, and I started going on to my next stage here. Now, this one actually was enough to get me all the way to encounter with the moon. Now, getting this encounter was pretty easy, and you can see here, I started to approach the moon, and all I had to do was warp until I got pretty close to it, flip around so I'd be retrograde, and start to do my burn so I got captured. Now, I also extended out the solar panels, and I did this just to make sure everything was topped off before I sent off the lander. And with those all extended, I started to do my burn here. Now, pulling in the orbit wasn't really that hard again. I had a bunch of extra fuel at this point, and finally here you can see I ended up getting the orbit, and I ended up pulling it in so it'd be reasonably circular. Now, at this point, I just sort of randomly chose one of the landers. I popped it off, switched to it, and started to land with it. Now, I noticed I only have about 1,000 meters per second of delta V, which is kind of a problem because it's not really going to be that much to try to get back up here, and I was kind of wondering if this is even possible. And of course, when I was landing here, I wasn't paying that much attention, and I was starting to land at night. So I ended up raising the brightness for you, but it's still ridiculously dark here. And trying to do this landing, I realized it was actually very unstable as well, and with all that combined, it basically became impossible to land with this, and I just ended up hitting the surface. So I just loaded back into my save, and I actually chose the other lander, and I noticed this time I have about 2,000 meters of delta V, and that's probably a little bit better. And I also chose to warp this time so that I'd be landing during the day. This landing at night is very difficult for everyone. Now, I started here by facing retrograde, and I was going to start doing a burn, but the rocket's actually really unstable, and it's because this one doesn't have any gimbal. So I have to rely on the SAS to pull me in the opposite direction, and it's a little annoying. Now, I realized the maximum throttle I could use was like pretty much 10%, which is not great, but it actually should be enough force to get me off the ground, so I wasn't too concerned. But you can see here, starting to do my burn, and I'm slowly falling down, and I'm just making sure I don't get too fast, because again, I have limited throttle here, so if I go too fast, there's no chance of recovering it. Now, I ended up landing in this crater, partially by choice, partially by luck, but anyway, I ended up hitting the ground here, and I wasn't really planning on sitting there for a while, because if I fall over, there's no chance I'm getting back up, so I ended up barely touching the ground and stopping, and once I did that, I was right back up and ready to reconnect. Now, I tried to save a few times, but you had to be high up enough to do that, so eventually here, I boosted up enough that I could drop a quick save and try to get this done. So the first thing I tried doing here was turning a bit to the side, and this is because my orbit needs to be in this direction, but I ended up being a little bit too low, and I burned a little bit too hard, and that just caused me to run pretty much straight into this crater, and there's basically no recovering from that. So loaded up again, and this time I tried aiming up a little bit higher, and this seemed to be a lot better. I was still pretty close to the ground for a while, which is a little scary, but once I got into this crater, it gave me enough time that I was able to burn up high enough, and I was pretty much good to go. Now, I ended up stopping burning, and I warped to the apoapsis, and with that done, I ended up continuing my burn here, and I just slowly circularized the orbit. Now, I kept it pretty close to the moon, and I actually switched to my main ship, and I used my main ship to connect with the little one. Now, the little ship I was running out of fuel, so I just wanted to make sure I definitely had enough to get this done. With that done, I ended up getting them close together, and I just slowly started bringing them close together. After a while, I got them a separation of only 600 meters, and that was close enough to pretty much get everything done. So I can see my ship over there, and I just started to do a burn so that I get their orbits pretty much identical. And with that, I just started facing towards it and burning a little bit. After a few of those cycles, you can see here, I actually got all the way to 200 meters away, but I ended up warping until the day, so it'd be a little bit easier, and at this point, I was only about 300 meters away. And with that done, repeat the same steps, burn retrograde to kill my speed, burn straight towards it, and this time I was close enough, I could pretty much kill my speed and start using my RCS thrusters to bring my way towards it. And after a little while, you can see there, just slowly got my way in. I actually ended up bumping off it at first, so I had to be a little bit careful, but I reconnected just fine. And with that done, it was time to extend out my orbit and get to Minmus. Now, the reason I wanted to go to Minmus is that other engine, since it's so weak and has so little fuel, I needed a pretty light body to land on, and since Minmus is already right here, it's a pretty easy target to go for. So I ended up just waiting until I got an encounter after that point, and I slowly messed around my orbit, and eventually here, I ended up getting a pretty close encounter, and you can see Minmus now. So with all that done, it's actually pretty similar to landing on the moon. Just had to make sure to burn retrograde, kill my speed, pull in the orbit a little bit. Once I got it reasonably circular, time to deploy the lander and try getting the landing done. So just faced retrograde, and I actually burned for a pretty short amount of time here, and that was enough to get me all the way towards the ground. Now, when I was burning down here, I had a great flat area to land on. That was awesome, but I realized I had limited control, and I wasn't able to turn up my thrusters at all. So there was really nothing for me to do here, and I ended up changing my landing zone so that Kerbal was just barely over the horizon of Minmus. I was actually able to find a relatively small flat spot on Minmus, and it was just enough for me to get my lander on, and unfortunately I couldn't land straight up and down, but I figured this actually shouldn't be too big of a deal since the vector engine can gimbal so much. I should be able to just tilt it and get myself up off the ground. Now, it took a couple involuntary front flips, but it was still enough to get me off the ground here, and just started to burn up. Now, reconnecting was exactly the same procedure, but it was a lot easier this time since there's a lot less gravity here. And with that done, ended up using the RCS, reconnected the docking ports, and had it all connected up again. So finally, with that done, I ended up warping away from Minmus, and now it's actually time to go to Jool. Now, getting there is going to be a little annoying, because normally you could use Kerbal's rotation to fling you out in the right direction, but since I'm all the way out towards Minmus, it's actually going to take more fuel to get me up to speed. So I ended up setting my maneuver node here, and I wasn't expecting it to be this high. So I have the fuel to do this, I just prefer not to, and I ended up getting it down by about 250 meters per second of delta V, and I was pretty happy about that. And once I got there, it was time to burn the very last of my fuel here, and that was enough to get me an escape. But after that, I had to move on to the next stage, and it's going to be the Xenon engines. Now, I turned them on, and the first thing I noticed is that they're extremely slow. And I actually went to check, and you see how slow the delta V is going down. And the burn time's a day, which is only 6 hours, but that's still a really long time. But I pretty much have no choice at this point, so I just turned on physics warp so I can at least get 4 times speed. And once I had that done, I just let my computer run for an hour and a half here and just let it slowly expand out that orbit. And finally here you can see after all that time, thankfully I was at my computer at the time, so I was able to catch it as soon as it got the encounter. Now it still took a really long time for me to pull that in and get it really close, but fortunately since these engines actually are so limited in their power, I was able to get it really controlled to 3 million meters. That's going to save me a lot of time later trying to move around this, because ideally I want to be 200,000 meters away from Jool, so I could just barely avoid the atmosphere and get the most efficient burn possible. And you can see here with an adjustment burn, I managed to get it all the way up to 200,000 meters. So far, everything looks good, and next thing I did just warp over to Jool, and I had to get over to the periapsis, but I have to be really careful here. Because I pulled it in so ridiculously close to 200,000 meters, if I go below that, if I hit the atmosphere at like 9,000 meters per second, I'm just gonna explode. So I have to be really careful here. And I ended up throwing away my xenon tanks, and I realized this is kind of a mistake because it had all the solar panels on it, but also I could have used a little bit more of that fuel, but I ended up switching to the next stage here, and it seemed to work out just fine. I ended up getting my orbit here, and because it doesn't cost too much fuel, I ended up pulling in the orbit a bunch, which saves me a lot of time waiting. And I ended up getting a Laythe encounter here, and I wasn't gonna try landing on Laythe yet. I just wanted to use it to pull in my orbit and make it really limited. So after I had that looking good, I ended up just doing that burn here, and you can see me get that orbit and slowly pull myself in like this. With that done, you can see warping towards Jool and warping towards Laythe. Now Laythe sort of jump scares me here, but after that's done, I ended up warping a little bit closer to it, and no burns need to be done here yet. I just wanted to get a bit closer, and with that looking good, next thing I did, just wait for another encounter, and this time I'm actually trying to get captured. So to get ready here, starting to face retrograde, and with that, I start cranking my engines, and it seems to be going pretty well at first, but I have to switch over to my second engines here, and these are the ones that don't swivel. And that's that's kind of a problem because you can see here as I crank the engines, I slowly start to rotate out of position. So that's not going to work out so well. And what I ended up doing was transferring some extra fuel in and getting rid of my extra 2 ships here because I didn't really need these anymore. And with that done, I tried doing the burn again and it was better, but it was still moving to the one side. So all I could really do here is burn at about a third throttle, which wasn't really that great, but I ended up turning on RCS temporarily, and that was enough to counteract the turning motion. I ended up burning as fast as I could for a little while here, and ended up using a whole bunch of RCS fuel, but it ended up being okay, because you can see here, I ended up getting most of the burn done. I just had a little bit left to do without the RCS. So once I finished that up, I ended up getting rid of that stage, and I started working on a nuclear engine. Now, this one actually isn't that fast, but it was definitely fast enough, and you can see here, I ended up getting fully captured with it. And after that, I actually didn't pull it in or anything, I just left it as it was, and I ended up taking the time to fully charge all of my batteries here, and after that, I ended up deploying my first lander. Now, it didn't really matter the order in which I did this, but I figured that this one would probably be the easiest to start with. It has the most wings, so it makes it a lot easier to land with, and also it was nice and compact, so I thought I had a pretty good chance of surviving the atmosphere. I ended up using my RCS to slowly pull in my orbit, and I ended up going into about 41,000 meters. Now, I was hoping that I'd be able to just start to fall into it and slow myself down enough, but it was a little bit too harsh, and it ended up blowing up my air intake, which pretty much makes it useless. So I ended up pulling it into only about 47,000 meters, and that helped a lot. This time it was actually burning up in the atmosphere a lot more controllably, and I had to do another warp around, but after the second time, it was actually enough to get me all the way in, and I slowly started to fall down. Now you also notice I'm kind of spinning this around a lot, and that's to prevent any one part from overheating too much. Now I'm using some RCS fuel to do this. I'm also using a bunch of electric charge here, but it's worth it because it definitely slows me down faster, and it also keeps me from exploding. Now after a little point, you can see there, I ended up losing my RCS fuel, and things actually started to stabilize quite a bit. I started to turn up my throttle here, and I didn't see any thrust being produced at the moment, so I was a little concerned, but I figured maybe I needed to dip a little bit deeper. And eventually here you can see I get some flame in the back, and that means the engine's starting to work. Waited for the thrust to start picking up, and you can see I actually am sort of flying. Now I got to the point where my height actually did start to increase, and a little bit later than that, I also managed to increase my speed as well. And with both of those things increasing, it means I'm actually gaining energy here, so I am definitely flying. And at this point, I was just happy I got something to fly, so I just kept going for a little while here, but I realized I had a ridiculous amount of fuel. I had like 26,000 meters per second to delta V, and I could have flew for a really long time here, but I ended up deciding to do a quick dive and see how that would do. Wasn't really that great though, and I was unable to come out of it, but I was really happy with that successful landing, and after that, I ended up deploying my second lander here, and trying to land this one, it was super similar. I ended up burning up the atmosphere twice. The second time, though, I ended up dipping in, and it did fire off the engine, but I couldn't get this one to come up. It was either the lack of engines or a bad weight distribution, but it was basically impossible to fly, and even though the engine technically worked, it wasn't that great. So I was a little unhappy about that, but at least I had 2 more to get through here, so I ended up kicking off the next one and trying to get this one to work as well. And this one, you can see the engine working in the back, and it's really powerful, but I just couldn't get this one to nose up as well. It seemed like it really didn't want to work. And this one similarly just went straight into the water. So it wasn't doing so great on Laythe landers here, and I was really hoping this last one would be able to take it home. But this one was actually the least confident in working, because it was the one that had the double stages, and it has a limited amount of wings, so I wasn't that confident in it. But you see here, it's burned up in the atmosphere. I'm doing my technique of moving back and forth a lot to prevent anything from overheating. And after I got low enough, the engine finally actually managed to fire. And I was actually really happy about this, and I started to pitch up, but I noticed I also just didn't have enough force. But my thrust wasn't all the way up, and I really didn't want to try doing this yet, because worried it was going to push me into the ground harder, but it clearly seemed to be needed, and once I tried doing it near the ground, it had a really positive effect. I had a lot more control over it, but it seemed like it was just too late, and I ended up hitting the water. So I ended up loading my quick save when I was in the air, and this time I just started out with full throttle, and I wanted to give this a shot, and it actually pitched up quite well, and with this done, I actually managed to gain some speed and gain some height, so I was actually flying. Now this one actually did not have that much fuel, because the engine's not that efficient, so after quite a while, I ended up running out, and I tried deploying the top stage, but the engine just ended up exploding, and it didn't really pop off too well. But this one at least seemed to mostly work, so I'll take 2 out of 4. When you think about it, 1.5 rounds up to 1, so it was pretty good. And with that done, I ended up just trying to burn here, and now I'm trying to get away from Laythe. Now, I wasn't too confident that I had enough fuel for a return trip, and I had a bunch of extra engines, so I figured I might as well try to get home. And I had some staging issues at first, and I ended up losing one of my boosters. But after I managed to fix that problem, I started out with the Dart engine here, and this one's really good, but it seemed a little unbalanced, but fortunately, I actually managed to fix that pretty easily just by burning a little bit lighter. And once that was done, I launched the next stage and realized I accidentally put 2 dart engines on here, which isn't really that big of a problem, just gives me a bit more fuel, but I definitely didn't need to do that. And finally here with that done, I ended up warping away from Laythe, and I got back into Jool's sphere of influence. Now to get away from Jool, I ended up going for a ridiculously close Tylo encounter here, and I was hoping to just scrape it to hopefully fling myself away. Now I ended up pulling it into about 7,000 meters, and that I figured would be pretty cool if I could make work. And you can see here a quick time lapse of me pulling it in. And I ended up boosting the brightness as well, just because it was really hard to see. And I guess I didn't realize how close I got at the time, but I really scraped the surface there. Finally, with that done, I warped away from Jool, and I started to do some burns to get myself an encounter with Kerbal. So starting out here, I think I launched the Terrier engine next after that dart engine, and I realized instead of launching the next stage, what I could do is try launching the solid rocket fuel boosters to help me out. Now, at first, they were a little chaotic, so I ended up launching one of the engines at the left side to balance out the torque a little bit, and that seemed to work pretty well. And once these boosters ended up completely finishing the burn I needed to do, I ended up just launching them away. And after that, I just had a few more burns to do to pull myself into Kerbal's orbit. So I launched away that really small engine you saw there. After that, I just went for these small weight engines, which I never end up using. And I ended up trying to launch them away, and they seemed to explode, but it didn't break anything on my rocket, so not really my problem. After that, I just launched off these big powerful engines, and finally here you can see I got those spider engines going. Once that was done, I had to do the ant engines next. And after that, I had these puff engines. And at this point, I was actually pulling in my orbit just where I needed it to go. So with that done, I ended up doing a few more maneuvers, got myself near Kerbal, and I quickly realized I have nowhere near enough fuel to do this. So I ended up using my very last Sepratron engines here to get myself an encounter so I'd fall straight into Kerbal. So at the very least, I got that satisfaction. But using those completely finishes the challenge. So guys, thanks for watching. This video took way too long to make. There's like 16 or 17 hours of footage, and getting it all edited together was quite a lot as well. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and otherwise, until next time.